Great. Okay, so one afternoon when I was around 10 years old, I was walking across the Brooklyn Bridge with my parents. It was a very quiet afternoon, almost no one was around, and I remember just daydreaming about the moment we could cross to the other side and I could get my cup of Italian ices. Now, a man was approaching from the other direction. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He was walking his bike, and what felt like in a split second, things changed. Two boys approached behind him. They couldn't have been a few years older than me. They tried to take his bike, and when he wouldn't give it up, they chopped his hand off with a machete. They took his bike and ran. In that moment, I stood there stunned, not knowing what to think. My 10-year-old self didn't know that across the country, lawyers and legislators were beginning to talk to us about the myth, the prophecy, the expectation of juvenile superpredators. These were young people who were committing violent acts, who were bringing guns to school instead of lunches, and who had no care for human life. The prophecy of the juvenile superpredator led nearly every state in the country to expand laws that brought juveniles and young people out of child and juvenile courts and into adult courts, sentenced them based on adult laws, and sentenced them to harsh adult imprisonment. So the question is, was this prophecy of the juvenile superpredator true? Well, the simple answer is no. In fact, starting in the 90s and continuing since then, there has been a decrease in violent crime among young people. There is also no evidence that sentencing young people to harsh prison sentences led to any deterrence or change in behavior. So the myth of the juvenile superpredator led to great harms that affected many, not only those who were incarcerated, but the communities they came from. How was it so easy, though, for the government to convince us of this myth? Well, the truth is, there are some young people who commit unfathomably cruel acts. There are some young people who are violent. But what psychological science has taught us is that we have a really good sense now of the different ways that young people think and behave. They're different than adults. We know about risk factors that young people have for why they engage in violent behavior, and now scientifically informed interventions that can reduce their behavior. Generally speaking, when we think about our day-to-day decision making, we can think about relying on a variety of psychological capacities. We could categorize these in a very simplified way into cognition and emotion. Cognitive capacities relate to our ability to start, plan, and adapt our behavior. Emotional capacities have to do with our ability to generate, respond to, and regulate emotions. Now, as adults, we do our very best to try and balance the information that comes from cognition and emotion. But what we now know is that many adolescents have an imbalance in the influence of cognition and emotion, such that most adolescents rely much more on emotional inputs than adults. This means that adolescents can make sound and deliberate decisions, but if they're in an emotional context, if their fear or anger or anxiety is running high, or they have to make a really, really quick decision, they often struggle to make that controlled or deliberate decision. In a variety of experiments, we see adolescents performing way worse than adults in these types of capacities. So for example, when asking adolescents to respond to information and adapt their behavior based on what's presented on the computer screen, adolescents struggle to adapt behavior when presented with a fearful face compared to a neutral face. We see that adolescents don't perform at an adult-like level until at least the age of 22. We also know that adolescents tend to make much riskier decisions when playing an experiment with their peers than when playing alone. This is particularly important because we know that many young people commit crimes in the context or presence of peers. So simply speaking, the general psychological evidence suggests that adolescents are just psychologically less mature than adults, and it influences their behavior in very important ways. Now, an easy way to push back on everything I just said is that you're talking about general development, general adolescence, and most adolescents aren't walking around committing crimes or engaging in violent behavior. And that is a very important point. That is evidence that we need to consider. So what does science tell us about those adolescents who engage in violent behavior? Well, we know that for many of them, they have even worse difficulties regulating their emotions and engaging basic cognitive and emotional capacities like planning and adapting behavior and responding in sound and deliberate ways when emotions are running high. We also know that young people, particularly adolescents who engage in violent behavior, are often exposed to harsh and abusive parenting, experience violence in their neighborhoods, and lack basic economic and social resources. And for some young people, they have mental health problems such as conduct disorder, ADHD, and trauma-related disorders that further increase the likelihood of engaging in violent behavior. And all of these things, basic psychological functioning and environment, influence behavior in such important ways and are a reflection of how these exposures can get really under the skin and change basic brain function to lead to changes in behavior. So if we really want to understand the risk factors that are associated with why young people are committing violent crimes, we have to understand the environments they come from, their brains, and the interplay between the two. Now, it's important to remember that there are effective interventions, even for those that we consider the most extreme or most violent in their behavior. Most of these interventions, though, are not offered in prisons, certainly not adult prisons. For example, outside of prison, parent training interventions are extremely effective at reducing problematic behavior. Interventions that focus on rewarding pro-social behavior and helping young people develop life skills have shown lasting reductions in violent behavior. And interventions that engage youth rather than isolate youth in their schools, their communities, and larger social networks are extremely effective. Of course, also treatments that help address underlying mental health problems such as trauma are essential. But sentencing young people to prison not only stifles their growth, but removes them from opportunities to have access to these treatments. It ultimately creates harm for the individual and a burden on society. Unfortunately, we're seeing an increase again in the narrative that surrounds and equates juveniles with superpredators. We cannot let this narrative win. Decades of science has now shown us that young people are fundamentally different than adults, and different in really important ways that suggest they're psychologically less mature, but amenable to treatment and intervention. When we let an unscientific narrative win, we increase the harms. We have to commit to an era of truth and justice rooted in science. Thank you.